when I came back from visiting an old friend. I thought I'd find the porch light glowing and the quiet comfort of home waiting for me. Instead, I found my life scattered on the front steps. My lamp lay sideways on the doormat. My suitcase was half unzipped, leaning against the bushes. On top of it all, taped to a picture frame of me and my son, was a folded piece of paper, 6 words, no explanation, no warning, just a quiet removal. In that moment, I understood this was more than betrayal. It wasn't only that I'd been pushed out. I'd been replaced without hesitation, without a thought. Have you ever stood at your own door and realized you no longer belong there? The air that evening was heavy and still, like the silence before a thunderstorm. I'd only been gone a few days, spending time with a friend upstate. No fights, no tension, at least none I'd let myself feel. Everything had been calm when I left. Brendan hugged me before I got into the car. Kayla promised she'd water the garden. But as the rideshare pulled up to the driveway, something felt off. The porch light wasn't on. The windows were dark. Then I saw it. My suitcase sat neatly beside a plastic storage bin. A pillow I had sewn decades ago rested on top, its edges worn thin with time. Next to it lay my night lamp, 2 framed photographs, one of my late husband, one of the 3 of us when Brendan was in college. Pinned beneath a magnet, folded once, was a note written in Brendan's hand. Sorry, Mom, no space for you anymore, no punctuation, no signature. I stood there for a long time, perfectly still. I didn't cry. I didn't knock. There was nothing left to say. I picked up my suitcase, tucked the photos carefully inside, and slid the lamp under my arm. I walked away without looking back. My footsteps made no sound. No curtain moved. No one came to the door. The silence was louder than shouting could ever be. At the end of the street, I stopped once and turned. The porch stayed dark. I kept walking. That first night, I ended up on a bench near the community garden just a few blocks away. It wasn't comfortable, but I wasn't ready to call anyone yet. I needed silence, not the kind that locks you out of your own home, but the soft, steady quiet that lives in the early morning air and the rustle of maple leaves. That garden had always been my safe place. Years ago, before Kayla was ever part of our lives, Brendan and I built a compost bin there together. I taught him how to trim herbs without harming the roots. I used to bring him here after school when he was small, letting him run through the rows of basil and lavender. Now I sat in that same spot, older, stiffer, trying to piece together how everything had unraveled. The sun was just beginning to rise. When I finally stood and walked toward the bus stop, I didn't have a destination. I just needed to move. By mid-morning, I found myself passing a row of townhouses. Not far from the park, one of them looked familiar. Brendan and Kayla had once talked about moving there someday. It was a newer development. Wide windows, polished railings, clean walkways. And then I saw them, through the sheer curtains of the corner unit. I spotted Brendan standing by the dining table. Kayla sat across from him, flipping through a folder. Their heads were close. Their expressions were serious. Then Kayla laughed. Brendan gave her a tight smile, but his shoulders stayed tense. She held something up, a glossy brochure, the kind real estate agents hand out at open houses. I could see a picture of a modern kitchen, white countertops shining under studio lights. Kayla pointed at it with excitement. Brendan looked away, He picked up a mug, brought it to his lips, but didn't drink. His eyes drifted toward the window, and for a split second, I thought he saw me, but he didn't react. Maybe he wasn't looking at anything at all. Kayla said something else, and Brendan nodded slowly. His shoulders sagged, the same way they used to when he was a teenager, and didn't want to argue. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Little fragments from the past few months came back like puzzle pieces falling into place. The time Kayla insisted on handling the utility bills. The way Brendan avoided talking about the house whenever I brought it up. The strange mail with his name but my address. The pauses in his voice when I asked questions. I had missed the signs, or maybe I had chosen not to see them. I stood there until the curtain fluttered slightly, as if brushed by the wind, and then I turned away. My legs felt heavy as I walked, not from exhaustion, but from a weight I couldn't yet name. There was no confrontation that day. No banging on glass, no shouting at doors, just the quiet realization that something deliberate had unfolded behind my back. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It had been planned, calculated. And I was the last to know. I walked farther than I meant to, ending up at the edge of the lake near the library. The water's surface was still, flat like glass, and I sat on the stone wall for a long while, letting the silence settle into me. I didn't cry, but for the first time since reading that note, I started to wonder just how deep this betrayal really ran, and how long it had been in motion. The next morning, I wandered toward the public library, not for books. I needed an outlet and a little quiet. My phone had died sometime during the night, and I hadn't packed a charger. Never imagining I wouldn't be going home. I found a corner seat near the window, plugged in my phone, and waited as it hummed back to life. Only one notification waited for me. A missed call. Brendan. No voicemail, no text. Just a timestamp 11:40 p.m. I stared at the screen for a moment. He hadn't followed up. I locked the phone and slipped it into my pocket, telling myself I wouldn't think too hard about it. That was when I heard a familiar voice, say my name softly. Then again, a little clearer. I turned. Standing there was Martina Wilkes. We hadn't seen each other in nearly 6 years. We used to work together at a legal insurance review firm. Back when I still carried a briefcase and deadlines ruled my days, Martina was sharp, meticulous, the kind of woman who could spot a missing comma in a 60-page contract without reading twice. She wore her confidence like armor. And she still carried herself that way now. We hugged briefly. She asked what brought me there, and I gave her a vague answer, just passing time. She didn't push. Martina always knew when to leave space. A few minutes later, she came back with 2 paper cups of coffee from the vending machine down the hall, and we sat by the side window, watching a few teenagers arguing quietly over a laptop. After a little small talk about politics and aching knees, Martina leaned in. She said she'd seen Kayla the week before at a local property mixer. Her tone shifted, careful, cautious. Kayla, she said, was all smiles, talking about plans for the house, listing it soon. Martina assumed I had already moved out. I didn't answer right away. I guess my silence told her enough, because she studied my face, like she was reviewing a legal document line by line. Something doesn't feel right, she said. I nodded slowly. Martina asked if I still had access to the house title. I used to, I said quietly. Her expression hardened. She told me about a case she once handled. A daughter-in-law gained power of attorney, quietly switched ownership, moved the mother-in-law into assisted living, and sold the house in 6 weeks. I felt the blood drain from my face. Not from fear, but from recognition. So many little things suddenly made sense. Kayla offering to handle the water bills. Brendan forgetting to pass along the insurance notices. The missing checkbook last spring. These weren't accidents. Martina reached for her bag and pulled out a card with her new number. She told me she still did consulting for women caught in complicated family transitions. She'd seen too many mothers pushed out of their own homes by paperwork and polite lies. I slid the card into my pocket, but I already knew her number by heart. I sat there for a long time after she left, watching the sunlight shift across the floor, thinking about the home I thought was mine. Later that afternoon, I walked to the post office and rented a small P.O. box, my name, my address. Even if it was just a metal drawer in a federal building, it was mine. Somewhere Brendan and Kayla couldn't reach. That evening, I checked into a small women's shelter nearby. I sat by the window, watching the sun stretch across the sidewalk. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel sadness. I felt clarity. The storm wasn't over, but I was finally turning to face it. The next morning, I unlocked a door I hadn't opened in more than 5 years. My old studio. The key still worked, even though the brass had dulled with time. The space sat above an old bookstore downtown. A quiet place I'd once used to meet clients. When I did part-time consulting on insurance claims after Richard passed. Back then, the house had felt too heavy with memories, so I'd kept this studio as my retreat, my quiet little corner of the world. No one but Martina had ever known about it. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon oil and dust, with the soft trace of dried lavender from the sachet I'd tucked into a drawer years ago. I closed the door behind me, letting the silence settle. I ran my fingers along the edge of an old bookshelf, then across the desk where I used to organize pension forms for widows who had nowhere else to turn, in the back cabinet, under a stack of manila folders and a chipped holiday mug. I found what I was looking for, the original deed, the notarized copy of the house title, everything still in my name. Brendan's wasn't mentioned anywhere, not even as a beneficiary. I sat down at the desk and spread the papers out in front of me. There was more. Underneath the deed was the co-ownership agreement Richard and I had signed. When we bought the house, it clearly stated that if one of us passed, the other retained full ownership. We had never added Brendan. We'd wanted him to build his own life, not inherit ours. I pulled out the most recent utility bills I'd brought from the house. Every single one was now addressed to Kayla. My name had been erased, not slowly, but suddenly, as if I had never existed there. On top of one envelope was a copy of a utility request form, with a signature that was supposed to be mine. It wasn't. I knew my own handwriting. This was forged. I sat there, staring at the papers, until the reality sank deep enough to hurt. They hadn't just been replacing me in the house. They were trying to erase me on paper, to make it look like I had never been there at all. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just moved. I took the deed, the co-ownership agreement, and tucked them into the small fireproof safe under the desk. Then I added a copy of my ID and my last tax return, the one that still listed the property under my name. I locked the safe carefully, When I looked up, I noticed the photo on the shelf. Richard and I at a fundraiser, both laughing, both alive. No picture of Brendan here, no Kayla. This space had stayed untouched, and mine. I closed the studio door softly behind me, not because I was afraid of waking anyone, but because something sacred had shifted. They thought they'd erased me, but they had no idea what I still held, not just legally, but in memory, in proof, and in resolve. The next morning, I stood outside Martina's office clutching a large envelope beneath my coat. The city moved around me like nothing had changed. People hurrying by with coffee cups, checking their phones, thinking about errands and meetings. None of them knew I was carrying my entire life in my hands. Martina greeted me with that same no-nonsense look she'd always had when we worked together. Her office still smelled like lavender oil and copier paper, exactly the way I remembered it. I laid the documents on her desk without saying a word. The deed, the co-ownership agreement Richard and I had signed, the forged utility forms, the tax return, all the pieces of me they had quietly tried to erase. Martina didn't flinch. She flipped through every page carefully, then went back and reread the key sections a second time. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "This isn't a misunderstanding," she said. "They're setting things up to remove you, and I think they're counting on you not fighting back." Her words didn't sting. They just landed. I realized how long it had been since anyone had said out loud what I already knew. Martina reached for her phone. "I know someone," she said. Within minutes, she had arranged a meeting with a retired estate attorney she trusted, a woman named Ashby Sterling, used to specialize in asset protection for women your age, Martina said. "She doesn't just read contracts, she reads people." 2 days later, I found myself standing on the porch of Ashby's home office. It was a small, tidy house with white shutters and a wooden swing swaying gently in the breeze. The front curtains shifted, as if someone had just walked past them. Ashby opened the door before I knocked. She was maybe 5 years older than me, her silver hair cut short, her presence calm but steady, like someone who never had to raise her voice to be heard. She invited me inside and gestured to a chair by the window. I handed her the envelope. She read everything carefully, her sharp eyes moving with a surgeon's precision. When she was done, she folded her hands over the documents and spoke in an even tone. "Nothing in these papers changes the fact that you are still the sole legal owner of your house. The utilities being transferred, the mail being redirected, even the digital address changes. None of that is a lawful transfer. But if they attempt to use these forged documents to refinance or sell the property, that crosses into fraud." I nodded slowly, feeling warmth crawl back into my cheeks. I hadn't even realized how cold I'd been carrying all of this. Ashby laid out the next steps, each one deliberate and precise. First, she would draft a formal cease and desist letter. Second, we would notify the county clerk's office to flag any unauthorized transactions on the title. Third, she would file a protective memorandum, a soft legal restriction that would trigger alerts if anyone tried to alter ownership without my written approval. "It's not dramatic," she said, "but it's effective." That afternoon, we printed every document, and I signed my name on each page with a pen that didn't shake. Martina arranged for a courier to deliver one sealed envelope to Brendan's law firm downtown, and another to Kayla's wellness clinic. Ashby also suggested filing a protective notice with the neighborhood council and local banks from now on. If anyone tried to use my name or make claims on the property, they'd face an immediate red flag. It wouldn't stop them entirely, but it would slow them down. By the time I left Ashby's office, I felt steadier than I had in months. I glanced in the hallway mirror and barely recognized myself. Yes, I looked tired, but behind my eyes, there was something new. A quiet strength, a line finally drawn. They hadn't taken everything. They had just mistaken my silence for surrender. And that mistake, I decided, was one they'd regret by the end of that week. Every letter had been sent, one to Brendan's downtown law firm, one to Kayla's wellness clinic, another copy filed at the county clerk's office. Flagged and sealed, I hadn't spoken a single word to either of them since the morning I'd walked away with my suitcase. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, my phone began to ring. Brendan's name lit up the screen. I let it ring out. Then it rang again and again. No voicemails, no texts, just call after call, spaced like he was hoping to catch me off guard. By the sixth attempt, a message finally came through. Kayla, short, sharp, almost bitter. You didn't have to go this far. I stared at it for a long while. I didn't reply. Later that night, I sent one single line. Everything has a reason. So does this. I knew the silence would be louder than any explanation. The next morning, I walked through my old neighborhood just after sunrise. I didn't go to the house. I only passed by the park, near the garden where I used to bring Brendan when he was little. From a distance, I could see the blinds drawn tight. By noon, Martina called me. Brendan had emailed her firm's general inbox, asking if the documents we'd sent were legitimate. Ashby replied herself, polite, professional, but sharp enough to cut through excuses. She confirmed the cease and desist order was active, attached her license number, and offered him direct access to county property records if he needed independent proof. No accusations, no threats, just clarity. Stacked like bricks in a wall, that evening, Brendan showed up at my studio. He knocked and waited a long time. I opened the door just enough to see his face. He looked exhausted, not angry, not furious. Just worn down. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I stepped aside, not to welcome him, but to show him I wasn't afraid. He stood near the window, his eyes drifting to the stack of papers on my table. Finally, he spoke. He said he hadn't known everything. He said Kayla had taken the lead because she thought I needed rest. He said it wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I asked one question, not as a mother, but as a woman speaking to a grown man who should have known better. Why didn't you stop her? He stared at the floor. When he finally answered, his words came slowly, like each one cost him something, because I didn't want the conflict, because it was easier to step back, because I didn't think you'd fight back. It wasn't cruelty, it was cowardice, and that, I realized, was its own kind of betrayal. He asked if there was anything he could do now. I told him the letters had been sent. The alerts had been filed. The title was secure. The house was no longer at risk. I didn't tell him everything. I told him just enough. When he left, I closed the door gently behind him. Not in anger, not in grief, just with quiet certainty. The kind that comes when you finally see the shape of the truth and stop pretending not to. The next few days passed without a word from either Brendan or Kayla. I didn't expect an apology. I didn't even expect understanding. But I expected movement, and when it came, it was calculated. Saturday morning, a courier arrived at my studio with a plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a letter from a real estate firm, addressed not to me, but to Brendan and Kayla. Attached was a carbon copy of an internal request, documents for pre-sale evaluation of the house. My house. I didn't panic. I called Martina. She arrived within the hour, scanned the letter, and muttered a curse under her breath. We both knew exactly what it meant. They were testing the system, trying to find a way around the alerts Ashby had placed on the property. A quiet move, a shadow attempt. Martina immediately forwarded everything to Ashby. Within hours, Ashby filed a second-level restriction with the county property office and flagged the real estate firm directly with legal notice. From now on, any attempt to request information on the property would require notarized, certified authorization from me personally. The wall around my house had just grown taller and stronger. Still, what stunned me wasn't their persistence. It was their audacity, that they could erase me with a signature, pretend the years I spent building that home didn't exist. That night, I barely slept. By Monday morning, I thought things might finally quiet down. I was wrong. When I walked into Martina's office, she was standing by the window, a thick file clutched in her hands. Her face told me before her words did. "We've got a problem," she said. She spread the papers across her desk. The first page stopped me cold. A digital printout of a loan pre-approval application from a regional bank. Brendan's name was on it, and mine, next to my name, was a sloppy, almost lazy version of my signature, dragged and dropped into digital boxes I had never seen before. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Martina explained that one of her private record monitors had triggered a soft red flag on Brendan's activity. He'd created an online account under a joint ownership profile. He'd uploaded fabricated authorization forms, pretending I had given consent to secure a line of credit against the house. Included in the packet was a scanned copy of my old driver's license and a utility bill with my name barely visible, just enough to make it look legitimate to someone in a hurry, but not enough to withstand scrutiny. Martina's voice was tight. "This isn't manipulation anymore," she said. "This is criminal." I sat down slowly. I didn't feel shocked, not in the way I thought I would. It wasn't disbelief. It was clarity. A quiet, steady realization that Brendan and Kayla weren't just trying to edge me out of their lives. They were trying to erase me completely. Martina called Ashby immediately. Within an hour, Ashby walked into the office, a leather case tucked under one arm, her glasses low on her nose, her expression sharp enough to cut through steel. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She sat down, opened the file, and reviewed every page like a surgeon mapping an incision. When she finally looked up, her voice was calm but firm. "He's created a fictitious authorization trail," she said. "This isn't just unethical. If he submitted anything online, we're talking forgery, wire fraud." Her words landed heavy, but not frightening, almost grounding. Because now we had clarity, and clarity is power. Ashby started drafting immediately. First, she prepared a formal complaint to the bank's fraud investigation unit. Then she filed a quiet notice with the local district attorney's office under a special protective protocol. Finally, she prepared a third document, a property lockdown order filed with the neighborhood council and the county registrar. From this point forward, any transaction or loan request using my name or address would trigger an automatic freeze unless I appeared in person with government-issued identification. It was, in Ashby's words, a silent barricade. Brendan wouldn't know about it until he tried to move again. And when he did, he'd hit a wall built from paper, precision, and persistence. Martina sat beside me while Ashby worked, her voice soft when she finally spoke. Some sons, she said quietly, take after their mothers. Others learn from different examples. I didn't respond. I just stared out the window, watching a pair of sparrows wrestle for crumbs on the sidewalk, and I thought of Brendan as a little boy with grass-stained jeans and scraped elbows, running down that same sidewalk years ago. Then I thought of the man trying to write my name into documents I'd never seen. By late afternoon, everything was filed, flagged, and backed up across multiple systems with notarized affidavits. I left Martina's office carrying a slim folder, but inside me was something heavier than anger and steadier than fear. It was resolve. They had tried to erase me on paper, but now I had written myself back in. 2 days later, the message came, short, polite, almost too polite. We're having a family discussion Saturday. Hope you can come. It's time to clear the air. I stared at the words on the screen for a long time. Family discussion. Like those 2 words still meant something. Like I still belonged. I forwarded the message to Ashby. She called me within minutes. I'm going with you, she said, just in case. Saturday afternoon arrived gray and cold, the kind of wine that makes you pull your coat tighter without thinking. Ashby picked me up in her navy blue sedan, calm and composed as ever. Her briefcase on the seat between us. Inside it was everything: the notarized cease and desist, the property lockdown notice, and copies of every forged document we had uncovered. When we pulled up to the house, I froze for a moment, just looking at it. The white shutters, the red door, the planter box Kayla had filled with petunias last spring, the flowers now wilting in the cold. It looked the same, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. We stepped inside, and the scene was almost staged. Cushions perfectly arranged on the couch, candles lit on the mantel, a cheese board waiting on the table, as if snacks could smooth over betrayal. Kayla stood by the fireplace, her sweater perfectly tailored, her smile stretched just a little too wide. Brendan greeted us with a handshake, his eyes darting nervously between me and Ashby. No one said right away. The silence hung, thick and deliberate. Finally, Kayla broke it, her voice smooth, rehearsed, like a pitch meeting she'd practiced in the mirror. We know things have been tense lately, she began, and we just wanted to have an open, respectful dialogue. This is still your home, too. She gestured toward the room, like she was giving me permission to exist inside my own walls. Ashby didn't let her finish. She opened her briefcase, pulled out the notarized letter, and placed it gently on the table between us. Her voice was calm, but every word landed like stone. Actually, she said, this home belongs solely to my client, Mrs. Marjorie Lindell. She remains the only legal owner on all official records. Any statements or actions suggesting otherwise have been formally challenged, documented, and filed. Her tone left no room for argument. This isn't a discussion, she added quietly. It's a confirmation. The room went still. Brendan paled. Kayla blinked once, then again. The kind of blink people do when they're carefully crafted plans suddenly split open. Ashby continued, her voice steady, unwavering. We are also aware of forged documents submitted to multiple institutions. Those filings have been reported and flagged. Further action is pending. For now, my client reserves the right to pursue charges if necessary. Kayla's voice dropped, the sweetness gone. This isn't how we wanted to handle this, she said. I looked at her for the first time that day. Really looked, and for the first time, I saw the cracks, the loss of control, the realization that whatever story she'd been spinning had just unraveled in her hands. Brendan started to speak, then stopped himself. He just stared at the document, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a speech. I just said, "You tried to write me out of my own life. You thought I wouldn't notice." Then I turned to leave. Ashby followed, but paused at the doorway and spoke one final line, low and deliberate. "If you attempt to interfere again, legal proceedings will follow immediately." Outside, the wind was colder than before, but it felt clean, fresh. We didn't talk during the drive back. We didn't need to, because in that silence, something had shifted. They had tried to bury me in paperwork, but I had shown them. I was still standing. The next morning, I packed a small overnight bag and walked into the old house one last time. I still had the keys. I still held the deed. But ownership and belonging are not the same thing, are they? Kayla stood in the kitchen, washing dishes with sharp, angry movements. Brendan sat at the dining table, hands folded like a scolded child, staring down at his plate. Neither of them spoke. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the silence draw its own boundary. Then I said it. "I'm selling the house." Kayla froze, her hands tightening around a wet plate. Brendan looked up, his lips parting but no words coming out. I continued, my voice steady, gentle but unshakable. "This isn't revenge. This isn't punishment. It's mine. And I no longer want to share my name with walls that have forgotten me." I placed a folder on the table. Inside was the signed listing agreement. Ashby had handled everything quietly, with the precision of someone who had seen it all before. Brendan's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "But where will you live?" I looked at him, not unkindly, but without softness. "That's not your concern anymore." He blinked, then looked down. Kayla didn't meet my eyes. I saw her shoulders tremble, but I didn't offer comfort. Comfort had been spent. All that remained was clarity. As I turned to leave, I paused at the doorway. There was one last thing to say. The only thing that truly mattered. The sale proceeds, I said quietly, will not be going into your pockets. Kayla's posture stiffened. Brendan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping back to the table. I continued. "I've transferred the full amount into a foundation I've started. It's for women over 60 who have been manipulated, discarded, or silenced by their own families. It will help them find legal support, housing, and dignity." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. Martina will serve as the executive director. Ashby has agreed to oversee compliance. This house built a family, but families fall apart when love becomes conditional. So I'm letting it go. No threats, no arguments, just a simple fact. You made space by pushing me out. Now, I'll make space for someone else who needs it. I didn't wait for a reply. I stepped outside, closed the door softly behind me, and walked down the path like it had never been mine. The sun had risen while I was inside. I hadn't noticed until then. The sidewalk glittered with early frost, my breath hanging in the air, but I felt warm. Warm in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. Instead, I opened my phone and pulled up the address of my new apartment. Small, quiet, mine. Then I tapped send on the press release Ashby had drafted. The foundation would go public that week, just a quiet announcement. In the back of a local newsletter, nothing flashy. But I knew someone would read it, and I hoped they would sit with the feeling, not of anger, but of loss. Not because I'd taken anything from them, but because they would finally understand what they had thrown away. The apartment was small, but sunlight filled every corner. My bedroom window faced east, and each morning the sunrise spilled across the sill like a quiet promise. I kept the place simple. A reading chair by the window, one framed photograph of me, standing alone by the ocean years ago, hair tangled in the wind, a small lavender plant in a clay pot. I named it Mercy. There was no television, just a little radio that played local stations in the evenings. Soft jazz, weather updates, a quiet hum to keep me company. At first, the silence felt strange, like wearing new shoes that didn't quite fit. But slowly, it stopped feeling empty. It started feeling mine. Each morning, I made tea, laced up my walking shoes, and stepped outside. Behind the apartment complex, a narrow trail wound through lupine trees. I walked it every day, passing the same woman jogging with her golden retriever. We never exchanged words at first, but after a few weeks, she smiled first. I smiled back. Some days, Martina would visit, bringing pastries and updates about the foundation. Donations were small but steady. Then one morning, a letter arrived in my P.O. box. It was from a woman in Utah who had read about the fund in a tiny church newsletter. Her handwriting trembled across the page. "Thank you for existing," she wrote. I read about it twice. I sat there holding the letter, feeling something bloom quietly inside me. The old house had finally sold. Kayla and Brendan moved out before the transfer. As required by Ashby's filings, they didn't reach out again. No calls, no texts, and yet, the silence didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like space. In the evenings, I started writing, not for anyone else, just for me. Pages of memories and fragments of thought, stitched together inside a soft brown notebook. Sometimes I wrote about my childhood. Other times, I wrote about silence, how it can be a weapon or a refuge, depending on who holds it. Then one afternoon, a call came from a women's advocacy group in the city. Someone had passed along my name. They were hosting a seminar on elder autonomy and wanted a speaker with lived experience. I said yes without hesitation. That night, I stood at my window, looking out over the parking lot. Streetlights drew long shadows across the asphalt. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I just felt present. There was peace in that. I turned off the light, slipped into bed, and let the silence wrap around me, not to shut the world out, but to finally hear myself breathe. One afternoon, while rearranging the little storage cabinet under my desk, I found it again. The photograph from Brendan's college graduation. Everyone was there. Brendan, Kayla, even my sister-in-law from Nebraska. The frame had always been slightly too big, so years ago, I'd tucked a pressed daisy into the corner behind the glass. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. Someone had trimmed the photo. My face had been cut out, cleanly, not torn, not crumpled, surgically removed, as if I had never been standing there beside them. I stared at it for a long while, not out of shock, not even sadness, just recognition. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. I slid the photo out of the frame and placed it carefully into a small cloth pouch. Then I tucked it into a wooden box at the back of my closet. Inside that box were old house keys, a ribbon from Brendan's 5th grade spelling bee, and a birthday card signed only by his child, a crayon drawing of a single balloon. No grandma, just a balloon. I closed the box gently. No anger, no grief, just stillness. People think healing is loud, that it arrives like thunder, tearing through your life all at once. But sometimes it moves like breath, barely there, quiet and slow. But when it comes, it changes everything. I didn't erase Brendan or Kayla from my memory. I simply stopped centering my life around people who had erased me from theirs. There's strength in letting go, not for revenge, not for pride, but for clarity, for peace. That spring, I planted a new lavender on the windowsill. Its stem leaned awkwardly toward the sun, growing crooked, but it grew, and that, I realized, was enough. I didn't look back, not even once. If my story finds a quiet place inside you. Thank you for listening. So many women walk through years of silence before they finally choose themselves. Have you ever felt erased? Not in words, but in presence. I invite you to share or simply to reflect. Your story, like mine, has weight, and sometimes, in telling it or hearing it, we bloom again, quietly, steadily, on our own.